Welcome to the CGMA podcast, powered by the AICPA and SEMA. This podcast is on the topic of risk.
Hello. Today we'll be talking with Gillian Lees, Head of Research and Development at the Chartered Institute of Management Accountants, about risk. Gillian, nice to have you here today. Organisations of all types face a seemingly ever-increasing array of risks that may affect their strategic success. Many are working to enhance their understanding of what risks their organisations face and to manage their emerging risks by embracing an enterprise-wide risk oversight process, which many people refer to as enterprise risk management. Gillian, can you give us a brief overview of what risk is in a business context and the kind of strategies organisations are employing to manage risk?
Thanks, Matt. Well, fundamentally, risk is about dealing with uncertainty. And risks vary from business to business, but essentially anything that can have an impact on the strategic success of your business can be considered a risk. So, of course, there are different levels of risk with different resulting implications, but the challenge is to be aware of the risks you face and to plan as best as you can in the event that they may occur. We surveyed over 1,300 executives globally to gain an understanding of what corporate risk means in today's working environment and the range and breadth of risk issues they face. The findings gave us an interesting idea of what companies are currently facing in regards to risk. So, for example, 60% of organisations told us they were facing an ever more complex and wide array of corporate risk issues. Yet only 35% of companies have got formal enterprise risk management in place, and most don't believe their processes are particularly mature or robust. However, the good news is that change is coming from the top. There is pressure coming from boards of directors in most regions who are placing significant importance on enterprise risk management.
So the perception is that businesses are facing more risk in 2015 than they have in the past. Is this actually the case, and are there regional differences?
Firstly, our research shows that organisations around the world are facing a similar volume and complexity of risks, so no region is uniquely different, which probably makes sense if you think about our globalised, digitised, connected world. What we do know is that 60% of businesses we spoke to are facing more risk, and the complexity of those risks has increased. And an additional 38% of companies we spoke to reported an increase in significant operational surprises in the last 5 years. That demonstrates the necessity for robust enterprise risk management planning. The good news is that many organisations have implemented processes to strengthen their top-down strategic approach to risk and have started to implement enterprise risk management strategies. Overall, roughly 1/3 of the businesses we spoke to believe that they have implemented adequate enterprise risk management. But that means that globally there's still a lot of work to be done to safeguard organisations. That said, though, most executives do appreciate the interconnectedness of risk and return. So actually proving the strategic importance of enterprise risk management to an organisation's success should be an easy message to sell. Unfortunately, for many organisations, though, risk oversight and strategic planning efforts seem to be disparate activities, which doesn't make much sense given the importance of risk to strategy.
Within the organisations contacted in your research, where is the change towards more robust enterprise risk management coming from?
Well, as we've already seen, the external environment is a big driver here. But there's also pressures coming from different players in the business field. So several parties are asking for increased involvement in this area. So the main changes are coming from the board of directors, audit committees, other C-level positions such as a chief financial officer, the chief executive, presidents of companies if you're talking about the US. And it's really encouraging to see people in such senior positions give risk management their full support, because after all, it's the responsibility of the board and the senior management to set the right tone from the top and the right risk culture. And we've actually seen an example of this only in the last week with Toshiba, where the senior executives and the board were not setting the right risk culture. Another key driver is actually regulators and stakeholders. So, for example, in the UK, there's more guidance now requiring organisations to think more about risk And organisations also have to report more on their main risks and what they're doing about them to manage them. So the pressure's coming from a number of different quarters.
Taking a look at the underlying risk identification processes and risk assessment processes, what kind of techniques are organisations deploying to identify, assess and monitor risk?
Well, while we see relative similarities across the regions in regards to the amount of risk organisations are actually facing, there's quite a difference across different regions when it comes to actually managing and identifying risk. So, for example, about half of organisations in Europe are actually maintaining what we call risk registers, or in the US we call them risk inventories. And that's basically a list of all the risks faced by the organisation. And in Europe, they look at them across individual business functions and also at the enterprise level. That figure drops somewhat across other regions, so Asia and Australasia, Africa and the Middle East and the US. When it comes to risk identification, Europe tends to lead the way, with over half of organisations having some form of formal policy statement which sets out their approach to risk management. Again, over half of organisations in Europe have actually formally defined the meaning of the term risk, so that employees really can understand what it means and how to help them identify and assess risk. So what we're actually seeing is that across the world, really with the exception of the US, there's a lot of emphasis on creating specific tools to help organisations identify risk, understand the likelihood, understand the impact. But what's encouraging is that about half the organisations we spoke to have formally defined risk so they really understand what it means. And that's great because risk is everybody's responsibility. But I would add a word of caution here, because you can have all the right tools in place, but don't let them lull you into a false sense of security, because other issues are important too, like behavioural risks. So tools are important, but they're not the whole story.
So what's stopping a greater number of organisations doing this and ensuring processes are in place?
Well, there's probably two main reasons. And understanding these barriers to achieving effective enterprise risk management has been one of our main focuses with the research. So one of them is really competing priorities. That's a persistent theme across all regions. And that goes with insufficient resources. And they're very, very challenging barriers because they're often business critical items that must be prioritised. Another key perceived barrier is a lack of understanding around the value that good enterprise risk management can bring, and that really needs to be addressed. And that message has to come from the top down. And it's really about articulating the value proposition of good risk management and show why it's so useful to integrate it into the strategy conversation, to show how good risk management helps organisations be more agile and resilient. And actually what that means is if you're good at risk management, you can actually seize more opportunities. And so you can get better business because you're good at managing the basics.
Is it essential that organisations have a chief risk officer?
Well, in some sectors, notably the financial services sector, there are requirements to have someone designated as chief risk officer. But beyond that, many organisations don't actually have someone designated in that role. But many do have internal risk committees, which are made up of managers who are responsible for risk management. And over 3/4 of them meet pretty regularly on a monthly or quarterly basis. So that's really showing that time is being dedicated to risk. So what do people talk about when they talk about risk? Of the organisations we surveyed, about half of them believe that their senior executive teams were considering risk when they were looking at new strategic initiatives. But there's really room for improvement, because what we found was that relatively low numbers were actually incorporating risk into issues like resource allocation and incorporating it into performance incentives and that sort of thing. So the problem is, without this effective risk management, organisations are just not prepared for managing complexity.
Thanks, Gillian, for that insight. Is there anything else you'd like to add?
I'd just like to reinforce a couple of messages, which is, don't be lulled by your risk management tools and understand the paradox that the better you are at managing risk, the more risk you can actually take by seizing more opportunities. It's also important to know that risk has to be embedded throughout the business. It really is everybody's responsibility. So there's lots of room for more communication and education about risk. And it was disappointing in our survey to find that less than 20% of organisations have provided training and guidance in this area over the last 2 years. Another big issue to really factor into thinking is reputation. So, for example, organisations like Thomas Cook have suffered losses of reputation because of a failure to manage key risks. And just as a parting comment, there's lots of potential with big data. We hear a lot about data and analytics. Well, that's got great potential in the risk area to combine external information, your own information together to really get some insights as to where your main risks are.
Great. Well, many thanks for talking to us. And thanks to everyone for tuning in. I'm Matt Hurst with Gillian Lees for CIMA. See you all next time.
For more information on our work on risk as a business issue, please visit our website, cgma.org.